Hello. So in the 5.3 special program livestream, the developers said that a very difficult combat event was going to happen in 5.3, and the least I can say is they were not lying. This event is called On the Trial of Behemoth, and at first I didn't pay much attention to it. I got my gold medal for the rewards, quickly tried the platinum, and I assumed it was only for whales, so I didn't bother with it. But then I saw that some people actually managed to do it at free-to-play investment, so that made me want to try too. In hindsight, it was probably a bad idea, considering the amount of time it took me, but hey, I got a .png file with fancy medals on it, so I guess it was worth it? Anyway, let's get started with the easiest one of the four, the secret source automaton. At first, I tried to do the strategy where you break the pillars twice to deal a good chunk of damage to the boss. However, no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't get the last pillar in time, and got multiple clears at 1 minute and 31 seconds. But I realized that the boss was always very low on health, so I decided to give up on the double pillar strat and try to optimize my damage instead. At the beginning of the fight, we completely skip Mawika's E and we just start the rotation with Bennett's E instead. Because of that, this little bar on the top will fill up slower, which means we won't be able to break the pillars twice, but it also means that this will delay the timing at which the boss gets increased resistances, allowing us to squeeze in a big burst of 660,000 damage with Mawika before he gets his resistances, since with the other strategy, this burst would have dealt 50,000 damage instead. Then we get ready to jump on the pillars with Mawika's flight and sprint to break them as fast as possible, and we start a new rotation, with a Mawika burst that hits for a massive 1.1 million damage. And here I messed up the rotation a bit. I held charge attack too early on Mawika and didn't get the last two melts, but it ended up not mattering, since we can just squeeze in another rotation before he gets his resistances back up again, and after one more burst, we finish the fight with a good 19 seconds to spare. Also, I forgot to mention it, but you can use food in this event, so you're basically always going to see me with food buffs, in this case Adeptus Temptation and the Fire Buffing Potion. Anyway, now let's move on to the second boss, the Tulpa. At first, I tried an overload team with Xiongling, Ororon and Chevreuse, and damage-wise it was doing very well, but those mini Tulpas were just way too tanky, so I was basically forced to use Nahida instead. I used a team of Mawika, Bennett, Nahida and Xiongling, and since the boss is permanently infused with Hydro, I gave the Rain Slasher to my Mawika. Now, you might be thinking that a C0 Mawika without any Natlan teammates won't be able to get her burst back in time, but in this specific fight, it wasn't that big of an issue. We start the fight with Nahida's skill and burst to save uptime on Bennett's buffs, quickly use Mawika's E into Bennett's burst, use Pyronado on Guoba, and we drop the 200 stacks burst on Mawika, and we want to deal as much damage as possible in this first rotation, so we dash cancel every 2 charge attacks to maximize both Mawika's damage and Pyronado's damage, and we manage to take down about half of the boss's health in this rotation. Then we use Nahida's skill to kill the small copies before the boss consumes them, and because we used Mawika's E before and after using her burst, we have around 130 stacks for her next burst, and with that we can drop the boss down to about 20% of its health. Now, we wouldn't have enough fighting spirit for a third rotation, but at this point of the fight, the boss spawns a shield and gives us back all of our energy, including fighting spirit. And instead of trying to break the shield, we're just going to wait it out. The shield is way too tanky for this team, so we're going to preciously keep this 200 fighting spirit burst ready for after the shield. Now, this does mean that the boss is going to do an unavoidable one-shot attack, so we sacrifice Nahida to this attack before doing the final rotation. And I accidentally switched to Mawika instead of Bennett, completely messing up the last rotation. but I was still able to clear it in time, although we probably would have saved like 10 seconds if I didn't misclick on Mawika and used Bennett into Xiongling Burst first. Alright, now it's time to deal with the Legatus Golem, and that's where the difficulty really started spiking up. We need a character that can help destroy his Geo Shield, so the perfect candidate for this was Navia, and I'm going to give her Sacrificial Greatsword to help with her energy, as well as a 4-piece Archaic Petra to buff my Mawika's damage. We start the fight by using Mawika's E to generate some crystals for Navia, and bring the boss's shield down to half health. Then we get ready to destroy the wards, and we're going to destroy the last ward with Navia's Burst, which is going to allow us to do our setup while the burst breaks the boss's shields, and the shield will break exactly when we switch to Navia. We also made sure to squeeze in Navia's E after Bennett's burst to trigger Mailed Flower's passive, and to grab a crystal with Navia to trigger Archaic Petra. And with very precise timing, we can squeeze in a full rotation just a quarter of a second before he puts up his shield again. Then we make sure to use Mawika's E again to generate the fighting spirit she's missing, and we're going to use Navia's burst to destroy the shield as fast as possible. Once again, we let the burst destroy the shield while setting up our abilities, and this final rotation should be enough to kill, but out of panic, I released charge attack a little bit too early, making me miss my last melt. But thankfully, Navia was able to clutch it out, closing the run just a quarter of a second before the timer runs out. And now we only have the crab left, which was the worst one for me. Here we will have to switch to Neuvillette, but there's a first problem we have to fix. My Neuvillette's build is really not good. So after a bunch of strongboxing and popping a few fragile resin, we get a decent onset goblet that allows us to use a much better sands, and I managed to replace this atrocity of a piece with an absolute monster piece. But that's not gonna be enough. We need to take as many damage buffs as we can possibly get, so I bought a bunch of cooking materials to try to get both Neuvillette's and Farina's specialty foods, which are the best food buffs we can get for this team. And now let's get into the fight. At first I tried using an AI manipulation trick with Kazuha to force the crab to immediately do his ward attack right away, but I ended up giving up on that strategy because I couldn't find a way to line it up so that the boss loses his shield when all my buffs are up, so I switched back to a more traditional strategy. At the beginning of the fight, we can use all of our abilities except for Kazuha's burst, and we have time to use one full charged attack on Neuvillette to deal some damage to the boss. Then we immediately switch to Kazuha to Hydro infuse his burst, and I found it more consistent to shoot in a line that hits both the boss and the ward on the left at the same time, and then just focus on hitting the boss. Then just before the crab jumps, we funnel Neuvillette's E into Farina, and here the boss's shield health is just low enough for him to immediately start doing his healing attack. So I quickly Pyro infuse Kazuha's skill to trigger Neuvillette's passive, back off to not stand in the fire that heals the boss, and I'm careful to leave the boss's shield just low enough so that it doesn't break too early. I squeeze in another Pyro Kazuha skill to keep Neuvillette's passive active for a little bit longer, Shilonen burst into skill so we don't accidentally crystallize Pyro, and use Kazuha's skill again to swirl Hydro this time before sending everything we have with Neuvillette. And then it's just a matter of refreshing buffs and trying to deal as much damage as possible before the timer runs out. And that's it! We got all the platinum medals without a single 5-star constellation and using only 4-star weapons. Honestly, I kinda like this event. The Platinum is completely optional, and it really pushes you to optimize rotations. The bosses deal enough damage that you actually have to dodge attacks, and although they're sometimes a bit annoying, the clearing conditions can push you to have to adapt your teams to the situations, like using Archaic Petra Navia for the Legatus Golem, and using Naheda Monopyro for the Tulpa. However, let's be honest, I think the DPS check is a little bit excessive. I shouldn't need to use the most optimal foot buffs to clear with 1 second to spare despite playing the top of the meta characters. But with a lower DPS check and more bosses with interesting mechanics instead of just a big health sponge like this stupid crab, I think it's an event that has a lot of potential, and I'm curious to see what they're gonna do with that in the future. Anyway, that was it for this video. I'm not sure how useful this video is, since the event ends very soon and no one really cares about a platinum medal in a random event, but I still wanted to make a video about it. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!